Some call it the business of death. The worldwide arms trade is booming, and the number of dead from wars, gun battles, and armed gang crime is rising. With thousands killed every day, is it possible for governments to control powerful companies that dominate the global weapons market? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finnegan. When it comes to global arms trades and deals, the scenes play out pretty formulaically. Politicians shaking hands, a joint press release is issued, and an astronomical amount of money is spent. What often isn't mentioned, though, is the companies that are profiting from such deals and whether parties that sell arms to governments are complicit if they use them to commit serious human rights abuses. Whether it's warplanes, ships, missiles, tanks or guns of all sizes, the international arms trade is big business in every sense. Amnesty International says that military expenditure for countries worldwide in 2016 was $1.7 trillion, 375 billion of that on buying arms specifically. The United States, China, France, Russia and the UK sell more than 70% of all weapons manufactured worldwide, and they're all permanent members of the UN Security Council, the world body that's charged with maintaining international peace and security. At least a quarter of conventional weapons sales are to the Middle East and North Africa. And the human cost, 2.2 million people killed in conflicts worldwide since the end of the Cold War in 1989. So, which companies are making the big bucks in the global arms trade? Well, of the top 10 defense companies by sales, 7 of them are based in the United States. Lockheed Martin is number one, with $41 billion worth of sales in 2016. 3 are European: Airbus Group, BAE Systems, and Leonardo in Italy. Much to discuss on today's programme. Let's bring in our guests right now. Joining us from London, Lloyd Russell-Moyle, who's a UK Member of Parliament with the opposition Labour Party. From Lancaster via Skype, Tim Ripley, an independent defence and security analyst. And also in London is Ben Moores, a senior defence and aviation analyst with IHS Janes, which covers global defence procurement, defence exports and commercial aviation. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Lloyd Russell-Moyle, British sales of military equipment to Saudi Arabia topped £1.1 billion in the first half of 2017. Is the UK, quote, shamefully profiting from the conflict in Yemen, in which thousands of civilians have died and millions more are subjected to famine and disease, as one of your fellow opposition politicians has put it?
Well, the short answer is yes. Not just in 2017, let's go further back, and the year before last, over 4 billion worth of sales. And our criteria that is laid out by the European Union is clear, that weapons should not be sold when there is a clear likelihood they will be used for against humanitarian law and used for war crimes. Now the UN is clear and the EU is clear that what Saudi Arabia is doing in the Yemen is at least crimes against humanity in many respects, but Britain continues to issue licences. One reason because, of course, it weakened the licence regime a few years ago, and the second because there is political interference because the licences are decided not by an independent body, but by a government department overseen by a government minister who has other issues, particularly to think about around the amount of money that we can get in rather than actually the amount of people that are being killed. And yet the argument that's trotted out time and time again by ministers and civil servants in the UK is that Britain operates one of the most rigorous arms control, export control regimes in the world. And yet the UK continues, as you say, to export arms to repressive regimes, countries involved in conflict, and has done for years. So can we therefore say that the UK government's control regimes are anything but rigorous? On paper, they look nice and rigorous and shiny. In reality, we know from the latest figures, over 2 billion is exported in the last period to some of the most unfree and repressive regimes around the world. and that is because there is political meddling at all levels. During the checking process, we don't check against fraud in those companies. We don't check whether those companies and those sales have breached previous export licenses. We don't even check to see where the end users of those weapons are. We look only at the first user. Let's compare the UK with Norway, and only in 2015 there was a deal that involved a Norwegian and British company selling arms to African warlords. The Norwegians prosecuted and have tightened up their regime. The warlords are now in jail. And what have the British done? We continue to issue export licenses to that very company that has a brass plate in London. So that is the example of where it is complete hogwash to say that we have the strongest export license procedures in the world. On paper, yes. In reality, they're not worth the paper they are written on.
Tim Ripley, the campaign against the arms trade in the UK says that arms sales don't enhance security, they fuel conflict, repression, and they make the world a more dangerous place for us all. Are they right?
Well, all those things are very subjective terms, and the history of arms sales to Saudi Arabia goes back many, many decades. And the same weapons that the UK government sold to Saudi Arabia and had been used in Yemen 25, 30 years ago were used as part of an international coalition to liberate Kuwait that had been occupied by Iraq. And that was an operation that was mandated and approved by the UN Security Council. And the Saudi Arabians were part of an international coalition that was achieving what was called a humanitarian operation. So, in that case, everyone applauded the fact the Saudi Arabians were using British supplied equipment to liberate the people of Kuwait. So you have to be very subjective about these terms about when things are sold for use in human rights abuses. They may be sold many, many decades before, when the government of that country was perfectly friendly and was doing a legally recognised and approved activity. So arms sales are part of international diplomacy. They're part of international alliances. They're part of statecraft. They've been going on for centuries and will go on for centuries. Just because at a moment in time the Saudi Arabian government is doing something that certain parts of the British political classes disapprove of, doesn't mean that in 2 years' time, 10 years' time, the Saudi Arabians won't be doing something that we applaud. So, this is a thing that is of the moment. It will pass. It will go away. So you have to be very careful about using very emotive language in these circumstances.
But is the arms trade something that the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council has any business being involved in? I mean, is it ethical in any sense? Is there any moral justification for it?
Right. Well, first of all, the right of self-defense is enshrined in the UN Charter. Sovereign states have a right to defend themselves, to equip their armed forces, and to repel attacks on their borders. And they're entitled under international law to buy whatever weapons they want to fulfill those aims. Now, countries, it's up to them if they want to sell arms to sovereign countries to defend themselves. Most countries, in fact, almost every country in the world, now regulates the sale of arms. That they have to get approval of the governments. The era of uncontrolled arms sales dates back to pre-World War I, and now most countries, in fact almost every country in the world with any kind of defence industry, they have to get approval of their government to sell to a foreign government. So their sales are aligned with the interests of their home country's foreign policy. Now, there are different rules in different countries. Some countries impose quite strict criteria, or they try and have sort of quasi-independent oversight of these sales. But it's up to each country to set its own rules. There's no international treaty that says you can't sell arms. There are various qualifications on circumstances. The UN Security Council can impose arms embargoes which are legal, enforceable, and other nations are bound to abide by them. But unless the UN Security Council imposes an embargo on selling arms to Saudi Arabia, it's up to individual countries what they do.
Ben Moores in London, thanks for waiting patiently. I have a feeling you're going to say money here, but it's not just the UK. Why are some governments, the US, France, Russia, China, Israel, all so committed to their defence industries?
Well, I think there's two factors here. I think firstly, let's divide the market up into, I think, small arms, which cause 90% plus worth of casualties in a conflict, and platform and systems, mission systems, and the small arms market. Well, that's there's about 80 countries in the world which can supply small arms now, and we have no real control over them. For the large platforms, well, if you don't sell into them, Russia and China, and increasingly China, have viable alternatives. And of course, if you remove yourself from a global supply chain for defence, then you will, and you want to continue to protect democracies and your allies, then you are looking at your defence costs doubling, at least doubling, because you wouldn't be involved in key programs, you wouldn't be able to offset your costs. Large fighter programs just simply wouldn't be viable.
Ben, I read somewhere today, in the name of creating American jobs and keeping American companies at the top of that list of the top 10 arms manufacturers, that President Trump is perhaps going to loosen regulations on the Americans' weapons industry, and yet the number of jobs in the arms industry as a whole is in long-term decline. Is that right?
Well, okay, so if he does deregulate, it won't make any difference, because the American market is so large relative to American exports. It's, American exports are something like $17 billion a year. And you said earlier, Lockheed Martin does 41 billion. The US market is worth, hundreds of millions. So it's a very small part of their overall thing. Finally, even if he does deregulate, he has alienated so many potential customers that it is probably going to see a downturn in sales.
Lloyd Russell Moyle, what do you make of the fact that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council are responsible for something like 70% of the global arms trade? That's somewhat perverse, isn't it?
It is very worrying that that the Security Council, the people who are meant to be bringing peace to the world, are also the people selling death machines to the world. And let's be very clear, it is that there is a EU set of criteria that we are meant to be following. There are international agreements around the sales of certain classes of weapons, and time again we see British companies involved in that where they are flouting those rules. But it is only 2011 was the last prosecution, absolutely no activity in enforcement here in the UK. And I suspect that is very much the same picture in the other Security Council countries.
Tim, the UN's arms trade treaty has been in force, for 3 years now, and yet many signatory states continue to sell arms to governments that are accused of committing serious human rights abuses. Maybe a naive question here, but why is that? Why isn't the treaty working?
Well, because one man's human rights abuse is another man's freedom fighter. There's the definition of what is a war crime is very, very fluid. And you have the International Criminal Court, which is supposed to prosecute war criminals, and it hasn't actually prosecuted very many war criminals. So lots of countries are prepared to ignore alleged abuses in the interests of their national interest. Now we have in the UN Security Council, they impose sanctions that are legal, enforceable, and nations are required to impose them. But you have veto powers by the US, China, UK, France, who can use those veto powers to protect their friends. Now, those veto powers and the UN Security Council is the main venue where real sanctions can be imposed on states for doing things that the world disapproves of. And unless the UN Security Council is going to impose a arms embargo on Saudi Arabia, all those other treaties are you could call them second order issues. They are moral indignation, but they do not have the same impact under international law. Now, in the case of Iraq, they had arms embargoes imposed on them by the UN Security Council, and countries respected them, and countries and individuals that breached them were prosecuted quite considerably in the United Kingdom. So the UK has quite a robust process for enforcing UN Security Council mandated sanctions, and takes them very seriously. I mean, there are cases of prosecutions involving Iran and countries that have UN Security Council imposed sanctions. So until countries are prepared to take their concerns to the UN Security Council and get that body to back them, it is moral indignation rather than practical politics.
Ben, you talked about this argument, if we're not selling arms and doing it responsibly, then someone else will, and perhaps less so. Who controls the arms market, particularly that you talked about the small arms market and the damage that small arms do to people worldwide? Is there collusion between the major powers about who sells what, and can the arms trade truly ever be controlled?
It can't be controlled, and there's no collusion. No, you can't. It's very, very difficult to track. What a company in Serbia or China, or Pakistan or Sri Lanka, or Russia, and who they're selling, rifles to. It's extremely difficult to do that. You've got to remember that these countries would think that sort of oversight or that somehow this was a bad thing. They would think that maybe they might even find that amusing. And you've got to remember that that's where the trade is coming from. It's not coming from the UK, where something like less than 0.1% of UK exports are in that category in terms of dollar value. It's an irrelevant part of the market for us, especially, and that's for the rest of the West as well, because we can't compete on cost, and we are regulated. It's too costly to look into.
And Ben, we talked about President Trump perhaps loosening regulations on the American weapons industry. How many of those American weapons are going to eventually end up in the wrong hands?
I think that it's a fallacy to believe that somehow that major mission systems or platforms can be simply passed around. Aircraft have tens of thousands of components, and you need them all to be able to fly. You can't hide them. You can't simply pass these on to third parties. It's not like boxes in the back of a crate. You need suppliers to be able to provide you with the components. Just look at the Iranians in the Iran-Iraq war. When you start getting up to major systems, which is the bulk of the market in dollar terms, and I mean when I say the bulk, I mean 90% plus, that you simply can't conceal that sort of that end of the market.
Right, Lloyd, do you want to come in on that? I mean, does that make everything okay then that Britain is only selling big weapons systems?
Well, 2 points to make. First of all, I totally agree. It's a very small. Arms sales in terms of British exports is very small. That is a reason to stop treating it like it was a major industry that needs protecting and start treating it like the pariah it should be. Secondly, the idea that maybe China or Russia or wherever will sell arms as well, so we might as well do it, is a complete false economy. It is a false economy in terms of life. Let's boil this down to the street. It's like saying, well, down the road there's someone that's committed a mugging, so we might as well do it anyway. No, that's not how law and order at the national level or at the international level works. And I'm afraid it's a very dangerous slippery slope if we just say, well, someone else is doing nasty, immoral things, well, why don't we just go down that route as well? And the final point to say is Britain regulates not just arms that are produced in Britain and then exported out of Britain, but every single British person who is involved in the brokerage of arms. So if there is a British person involved in selling arms from Russia to Syria, for example, or from kind of from America to somewhere in Latin America, and there are British people involved in that. They need to be licensed, and that is also what is failing, and that is something that we could have a great control in, preventing British people in the sale and resale of small arms and ammunition, which is quite right, do kill most people, but we need to start regulating that.
We're running out of time here. I need a brief answer from you, if you can give me one. When arms sales are prioritised over arms control, when business and jobs take precedence over suffering and human rights in foreign policy, and when narrow and some might say dangerous visions of security dominate public discourse, isn't it time to argue that the arms industry has undue access to and influence over public policymakers and governments, particularly there in Britain?
Totally correct, and that's why we need independent regulators, not ministers deciding the rules and then regulating the rules. Totally right.
Tim, one thing we haven't touched upon here is corruption. To what extent is corruption a factor in the arms trade worldwide, and who's involved?
Well, this is a major problem in certain regions of the world, particularly in Africa and the Middle East, where you have countries that have no, what you'd call, accountable governments that have their budgets approved by parliaments or any kind of legislature. And in these countries, there is apt opportunity for abuse. You have small elites running these countries, and their public policy decisions are made on whims, which are vulnerable to influence by various means, whether it's through the payment of cash or an awarding of a contract to buy large amounts of oil from the country in return for the selling of defence equipment or a political alliance. So in certain parts of the world, activity that can be described as corruption, or is it just, in America they call it pork barrel politics, or is it just redistribution of resources? I mean, these are words that are very difficult to pin down, and what is described as corruption in the arms trade is very much linked to countries that don't have independent financial oversight of their country's budgetary process.
And Tim, very briefly, Ben was talking about the fact that big weapons systems aren't easily transferable, but it is the fact, though, that particularly when it comes to small arms, weapons that were sold quite legitimately and under license, responsibly, you could say, do end up in the wrong hands, don't they?
Oh, indeed. That they are the most, they call it seepage. These are weapons which can be, put on a crate in the back of a truck or a ship or a plane and just shipped somewhere else. They are endemic in African conflicts with warlords and smuggling and backhanders, and you have armed forces that are poorly paid, and the soldiers sell off the stuff, or the officers sell off the stuff as a means to eat. So the small arms sector is the one where seepage and sales and corruption are most endemic, particularly at low level, as you call it, cash corruption.
Right. Ben, one final question. You need to be brief if you can. Norway has stopped selling arms to the UAE over fears that those weapons might be used in Yemen. If they can do it, why can't the UK?
The UK could do it, and then have to find a good justification for it. You'd have to weigh up the pros and balances, because you don't want to necessarily alienate a partner who is fighting against Islamic extremism. You have to. The problem with the arms trade is it's complex, and we have to use the arms trade to support our partners who are being threatened by Russia, maybe by China, and we have to use it to perhaps destabilize people who are threatening our friends, and we have to use it as a way of being able to leverage, because once you've pulled that plug, you can no longer do it. So if we pull the plug over Yemen and we alienate the Saudis, and next they go buy Chinese weapons, then there's nothing we can do. And if Saudi Arabia has a revolution, like Iran did, and we have no leverage over them at all, the Chinese will keep selling them equipment. That doesn't mean it's right to sell it. It just means that it's better for us to have control, and when it's appropriate, pull that plug.
All right, gentlemen, many thanks indeed. Good to talk to you. Lloyd Russell-Moyle, Tim Ripley and Ben Moores. Thank you, too, for watching the programme. Don't forget, you can see it again at any time just by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion on this issue, join us at our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or you could join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finnegan, and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.